Check Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. Thanks so much for being here. I'm your host, Rob Shaw. We have the legislature back in session after a couple weeks of spring break. There is a lot going on, so we're going to bring the panel in. You know them each and every week. We have Jeff, we have Jillian, we have Maclean, we have Katy. Thank you so much for being here, sharing your insights with everyone. We might as well jump into our first topic, which is BC's Human Rights Commissioner, who released a letter this week to Dr. Bonnie Henry saying she would like people to put their masks back on, for the province to restore that mandatory mask provision that has ended so far, saying that the hasty end will have profoundly unequal effects on society, people with disabilities, seniors, Indigenous people, racialized people who are often at greater risk due to chronic conditions. And in her words, the requirement to wear a mask in indoor public spaces is relatively minor infringement on an individual's autonomy and an inconvenience in exercising one's rights. I thought we were done with COVID, but here we are once again. Katy, why don't you start us on this? It's a letter addressed to Dr. Henry. It's public. It's from the Human Rights Commissioner. What do we make of all of this?
So let's look at it this way. Like, the role of independent watchdogs is to fulfill their mandates as laid out in the legislation that governs their organization. And so Section 47 of the Human Rights Code legislation lays out the powers of the commissioner. And those include things like identifying and promoting the elimination of discriminatory practices or programs, making reports and issuing recommendations on how to prevent or eliminate those going forward. So personally, I think you can make a strong argument that our public health team, spearheaded by Dr. Henry, already takes into account vulnerable populations when determining COVID policy, and I'm certainly of that view. I think you could also argue that the commissioner's time would be better spent addressing other pressing human rights violations, harassment, discrimination, sexism, racism, and I am also of that view. But, in the legislation, she does have the power to examine and make recommendations on said policies or programs that she considers inconsistent with the Human Rights Code. But what I am especially grateful for is that the government, who ultimately dictates COVID policy, has thankfully said that they are not going to interfere with people's behavior more than it is necessary to stop the spread of the virus, and they won't be reimposing a mask mandate as a result of the commissioner's opinion.
Yeah, that was the response from Health Minister Adrian Dix. It was brought up in the legislature, and he was brought up in the media asking that, saying, nope, we're listening to our public health officials. Jeff, an overreach by the Human Rights Commissioner, or, a valuable point of view, or how do we get our heads around this?
I think speaking to human rights is always a valuable point of view. I welcome the intervention. I think that there's a legitimate human rights issue, or point of view at least, to be raised. But this, I'm a fan of literature, and it reminds me of a famous quote from the great Dr. Seuss in his canonical book, Oh, the Places You'll Go. Be sure when you step with care and great tact, and remember that life is a great balancing act. There's no bigger balancing act in BC today than managing COVID-19. Minimizing social impacts is and remains, as Katy said, right at the table, considered by Dr. Henry, along with all sorts of other interests, health interests, economic interests, mental health interests. And, I think that given the protection of vaccination, given the downward trajectory of serious cases in COVID-19, given our hospitals, our capacity is back in a good place, I think Dr. Henry has the balance right, and ending mandatory masks is the right direction right now.
In one of her interviews, she did say that it is, to use your words, Jeff, a balancing act between the inconvenience of not wearing a mask with life and death consequences for those who are the most vulnerable. And I heard that as well and thought, well, I assume Dr. Henry has calculated that balancing act in her role. But nonetheless, it started a big public discussion. Again, people asking if they're comfortable with this. Jillian, the BC Greens brought this up in question period to get a response from Adrian Dix. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I think the Greens have really taken an equity lens with their criticism of the government's handling of COVID, and trying to provide a voice in the legislature for folks who are still feeling like the shift to managing the pandemic as sort of like in terms of your personal risk as having disproportionate impacts, especially, for seniors who that might mean that they don't feel comfortable accessing public transit or can't, go out and do the things that they would otherwise like to do because they're concerned about people not wearing masks. So I think that it's a legitimate thing to be raising in the legislature for the Greens. I think, politically, it wouldn't have made much headway were it not for, because I think most people are pretty tuned out and kind of just don't want to think about COVID right now. But the Premier made some comments when he was questioned about it in a press conference later in the week about what he would say to vulnerable people. And he kind of had one of those classic organisms where he said, I would recommend that they use hand sanitizer, which is, obviously not going to help people who are worried about contracting the virus from airborne transmission. So, I think that it does sort of, will have a little bit more of a ripple in terms of, how people look at the government and its handling and how it's thinking about vulnerable people at this stage.
Yeah. There's a lot of people who still aren't just comfortable, not wearing a mask when they're indoors. And I guess this gives them a voice to have at least that concern raised again for the government to have to answer. Maclean, still getting good public feedback on viewing your various wrestling masks. So I'm assuming that you're on the commissioner's side here in restoring the mask.
I mean, people's sartorial choices with their masks aside, and I will apologize in advance for not remembering the quote I had prepared from Horton Hears a Who. Look, I think pandemic policy is either going to be based on science and the public health officials' best judgments, or it's not. And once we start getting into other offices of the legislature, the privacy commissioner, people who run BC Ferries, you're starting to confirm some people's worst suspicions about pandemic policy, and namely in that it's political. All of the points made before me are good in that it is always good to apply a human rights lens to these things. But when it comes to pandemic policy, it has to be scientific. It just does. There will not be agreement across the board because very few things in science have unanimity. But I don't want anyone other than Dr. Bonnie Henry and the Minister of Health being the final arbiters of pandemic policy, because otherwise that way leads madness.
Mm-hmm. Okay, can I just say, first of all, if as a parent you don't know your Dr. Seuss quotes off the top of your head, then you're doing something wrong, Maclean. So
I'm doing.
I just have that.
I'll have you know I'm doing many things wrong, but that is among them.
I have it deeply ingrained in my mind, but look on the issue of the Horganisms too, and people like to pile on the Premier for some of the interesting things that he says. But there is, like a kernel of truth in what he's saying, in that we're moving beyond the time when big government's role is to protect you from the big bad virus. And now it's up to all of us to take care of ourselves and protect ourselves from the virus. We've done many things that will make us more resilient, vaccination chief among them. But also there's all kinds of safety plans in workplaces and schools and public places across the province. So it's I'm not going to say that the hand sanitizer thing was the on par with Dr. Seuss in terms of public discourse, but it makes the point that it's up to us now more than ever to take care of ourselves.
It's the only way to stop
small
the spread
government
of,
and personal responsibility.
I like it. The only way to stop the spread of single-celled organisms is hand sanitizer.
Oh, how long have you been sitting on
about
that
35 seconds.
Okay, all right, well, fair enough. I think we're going to hear more about that personal responsibility on Tuesday. We get an update from Dr. Henry and Adrian Dix on booster doses, the fourth booster dose, the end of the vaccine passport, which is coming up on April 8th, I think. And also that move, Jeff, as you said, we don't call it the endemic phase because that brings up all sorts of issues, but the personal responsibility phase of choosing your risk level and those around you and your particular position on what you do and don't do. So yes, that's. I'm sure we're going to talk some more about that next week. I want to just touch on one other topic before we get to our next topic, which is the government declaring an action plan this week for the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And just a quick summary of that, 2017, the government's elected, says it's going to bring in the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. 2019, it brings it into law. Now in 2022, there's a 5-year action plan to implement it, takes us to kind of 2027, which is a 10-year journey we're in the middle of. Some of the hardest things are still yet to do on more recognition of Indigenous rights to self-governance and revenue sharing. And this action plan touches every single government ministry. It was quite a large press conference this week with some First Nations and Métis leaders speaking on the floor of the legislature as well. We're not going to debate it as a topic here. There's a lot that's going to come up in the weeks and months ahead as government actually turns that action plan into reality. So I'm sure we're going to touch on that again. I did just want to mention it because it was a big part of this week at the legislature. Moving on to our next topic, which is big news on the real estate front. Legislation tabled this week from government on a cooling off period. They call it a recession, right of recession. I think we're still going to call it a cooling off period. The bill lands on the floor. It is something in the range of, I think, 570 words. It's 2 pages. I've read elementary school book reports that are longer than that. There's nothing in it other than a promise for cabinet to fill in the details later. So how long is this going to be? What are the details? We don't know. But the legislation is here saying government is going to do it. Maclean, start with you first. I guess it's difficult to debate something that doesn't have anything in it, but is there anything more we can take from this, or is that kind of the fundamental issue of what this is?
I mean, speaking of single cell, the only answer here is no. We don't know what we're debating because there's nothing to debate. It is a vague intention to declare a cooling off period. We have no idea how long that period would be, 24 hours a week. We don't even have a hint this time. And so it's what are we even debating here? We're short-circuiting the process. The other thing is, it's very important to note, this is nothing to do with housing affordability. And we know that because the finance minister said so. She said this is a separate thing. This has to do with consumer protection, which doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It may well be a worthwhile thing, but we don't know what the thing is because we haven't been given a time that we can talk about. It's not something that we can put into the bucket of housing affordability because, again, the government has been quite clear on this. I think there's other things the government could do which would actually do more for consumer protection when it comes to home purchases. Mandatory inspections come to mind as something that would probably solve this problem in a better way. But again, we're all kind of working with our hands tied because it's just an intention for them to fill in the blanks later. And until then, we're just kind of, well, maybe it could be a good idea if it was this amount of time, but it's a whole lot of maybe.
Yeah, it's treating the symptom maybe, but not the disease of the actual problem of housing affordability. And we've talked about that in the past, supply and investors and all sorts of things that are issues here. Jillian, it's tough to talk about this. The Greens have talked a bit about how it undermines democracy, but at the same time, the idea of giving people a few days, we don't know how many days, to between making an offer, getting their financing in order, getting an inspection, all these things you can't put as conditions on offers right now because the market's so insane that you would be your offer would never be considered. Is there a value in doing that, do you think? And is that something that the public will receive well?
Yeah, for sure. I think that this is, consumer protection is, as a concept, a good thing to add into the housing market, which really can take needs all of the measures we can take to sort of lower the temperature and the frenzy that comes with buying homes these days. But yeah, the devil is in the details. I think that's why the government has been thin on details so far. I think they're still trying to mitigate unintended consequences. The Real Estate Association has suggested that this could actually inadvertently raise prices if people are sort of making multiple offers on different houses knowing that they'll be able to back out of them. So they want to make sure that they mitigate those unintended consequences. But I think, the reason why we're seeing it now, rather than, later when they've had time to figure those things out through consultation and analysis, is because they don't want the session to pass without having been seen to do something. There's so much urgency to act on this issue, even though this is, at best a drop in the bucket, probably. The minister isn't even saying that it's necessarily going to lower prices. I think, they feel like they need to be moving things forward as often as they possibly can.
Yeah, the legislation allows government to pass it this spring if the consultation and the work that's being done by this independent finance group on how to do this is a little bit later, then they can add it in. I guess that spring and summer are the busiest parts of the real estate calendar. So I guess that's why they're doing it this week. Jeff, there's a hostile stakeholder group involved here. That's the BC Real Estate Association. Doesn't like this idea, has its own idea, doesn't like the government reforms. Obviously, it has a self-interest, as the minister has noted, that realtors are profiting from the market. some of them say they want reform as well. How does government manage the kind of maybe not backlash, but the lack of support in some sectors for an idea like this?
Well, first thing I'll say is the cooling off period I generally need is after one of Katy's hot takes on the show to calm down and gather my thoughts. But look, I think the government will never back down from a fight with realtors, especially when you've got strong ministers like David Eby and Selena Robinson involved. You know, the trial lawyers tried it on the ICBC reforms, on the move to no fault. And the government stared them down, got the reforms they wanted, and I think they'll face down realtors on this too. Look, for most of us, housing is the biggest investment we'll ever make. Building in time for sober second thought is a no-brainer, and if realtors don't like it, they can go pound sand.
Pound sand. I love that phrase. Katy, cool off. Just a moment of serenity. Okay. Now,
I'm always cool and calm. And I was really happy that Jeff and I just had a very special moment on small government and personal responsibility. It was thrilling for me. But anyways, moving on, I actually want to pick up on what Jillian was talking about with the kind of like optics and the legislative calendar. So I think one of the challenges when you have a rushed legislative agenda is kind of how this rolled out. You know, it's less than ideal when you have a primary stakeholder, in this case, the real estate association, when they go out and publicly state that they're deeply concerned that the decision was made without adequate consultation with the sector or with consumers, and there isn't really a clear rationale for the decision. And it's even less helpful when the proposed bill is only 2 pages, as Jillian articulated. The devil is always in the details. So I think that the optics don't look great on this one. It has a tendency to make the government look secretive, high-handed. But I'm going to say, I would be a hypocrite if I didn't reiterate this. The legislative process is designed for the government in power to use it to their advantage, regardless of partisan stripe. That is why we strive for majority governments. It's so you can get your agenda passed in the most effective and expedient manner that works for you. So, like it or not, that's the way it is.
Well, and on housing, are we ever going to come up with any reforms from any government of any stripe that people of the whole stakeholder group is going to be like, oh yeah, way to go, unfurl the mission accomplished banner? Like you're gonna anger somebody, whether it's older homeowners who lose wealth, or realtors who lose money, or the entire sector, or investors, or first-time home. Like the idea that government will come up with housing reforms one day and everyone's going to be like, yeah, it's tough. I don't see that path. But Katy, just staying with you for a second, there was an interesting Angus Reid poll out this week that said 88% of people don't think the government is doing a good job on housing affordability, which is the largest dissatisfaction in Canada on that issue. And then the same poll, it said Premier John Horgan is one of the most popular premiers in the country still for the 5th year. And the NDP government is still in the mid to high 40 approval range, which it was in to win a majority government a couple of years ago. How do we reconcile those two things in your mind?
Look, Horgan has retained the top spot or top 3 spot for quite some time now. His personal brand, I wouldn't say is unassailable, but it's very strong. I don't think he does himself any favors. There was a moment in the House this week when he made an off-the-cuff comment along the lines of, I don't understand this affordability stuff. I'm sure the BC Liberals are very pleased that they now have an attack ad at the ready for the next election, as they should. So I don't know. My rule of thumb is if you're trying to insult your opponent, don't accidentally punch yourself in the face at the same time. But with regards to that poll, it doesn't surprise me that Horgan's popularity continues to stay where it is. And polling outside of an election, while interesting, is not always particularly relevant to when you get into a writ cycle, but it is useful for both the government, opposition, and public at large to understand where the primary issues are. The government still has 88% disapproval on this file, not surprising, but there's still a couple years until we have to go to the polls. I think that this is one small piece of housing proposals that they're likely going to be bringing down. Is it enough? Not even close. And it's also giving their opponents an opportunity to really exploit an issue that is affecting key Lower Mainland Vancouver area ridings as Kevin continues to grow into his role as opposition leader.
Yeah. Jeff? You want to jump in there?
Oh, sure I do. Hey, this is why we can't have good things. Look, housing affordability remains a huge challenge for British Columbians. But on that comment, that's what I'm getting at with you can't have good things. If you read the whole response, his whole response was in response to a question from Trevor Halford, who's a really good MLA. I think he's a first-term MLA from White Rock, doing a pretty good job. Raised a question about what are you doing to help folks with affordability? And the government said, you're saying we're doing a bad job on affordability, but we've brought in a childcare program. We've gotten rid of tolls on bridges. We've gotten rid of MSP. These are all things that are making life more affordable for people. So I don't understand where you're coming at on this affordability question. So, to pull the one thing, and again, I'm not going to say that it was like, hooray, you should have said that. But in terms of the context, it was someone saying, look, we're taking action on this. It's important. We're doing things. We need to do more. But, to say we're doing nothing is not a correct statement.
And my
Context
quick counter argument, is sometimes it doesn't matter what you say, it matters how it's reported. Because I don't know what kind of nerd bird is going to comb through Hansard and be like, this is exactly what he said, other than us, right? So something like that context.
It's me.
We're all in that club though. So it's key. It's the way that it is reported. And if it hits a key vulnerability, then that's where it becomes a challenge.
Taking one isolated line, what a wacky thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. The NDP is the best at that. When it comes to their opponents. So the Liberals and the Greens are just learning from the best. I think, it had the Premier said what you said, Jeff, we need to do more, we need to do better. That's perfectly legitimate. That's usually what the NDP says when they're questioned about affordability. But, I think we'll just see if that one sticks. I think that, like Jeff said as well, come election time, it comes down to the alternative. And, for the Liberals, they've elected a leader who is tied to the past, who I think there is still a lot of residual anger from the electorate for, the Liberals' management during the sort of beginning of the affordability crisis. And, for the Greens, they have to kind of settle on what is their identity when it comes to affordability. They haven't really landed on clear policies, a clear direction yet. There's still time. I think it'll be interesting to see. And then, of course, they've got to prove their viability as well in the ridings that they're going for. So still lots of time to go, and we'll see how it plays out electorally.
Maclean, we're out of time, so you're lost on this.
You're lost.
We gotta go. Thank you for watching. Yes, it is. Yeah, thanks for watching, everyone. Stick around if you're on Check TV. Coming up next, this is Van Culler with Mo Meir. Thank you for being here. Make sure you subscribe. We'll see you next week on Political Capital.